In this video, I will go over Chapter 11, Section 3, which is about abolitionism. So something to know about this chapter that focuses on religion and reform, one of those movements that falls under that category is the abolitionist movement. So it basically came about a time where people, both white and free blacks, were in need or demanded emancipation of the slaves. And so people felt like it was the time to end this institution. So first, let's talk about the African Americans in the North. So there was two different movements within the African American community. You have one which is centered upon social uplift that promotes improving yourself, getting an education, getting a career, some kind of profession, and that by doing so, you would eventually achieve equality with whites. Um, so that was one, and if you think about it, getting educated, getting a profession, it's a longer route, right? It's more of a gradual change. The second movement was led by a man named David Walker, who wrote a pamphlet titled Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. And so this gentleman was a little bit more radical, more extremist. He felt that he violence was needed, that whites needed to liberate blacks, or there would be a massive rebellion. He preached this idea of violence and fighting, and really wanted to um, persuade whites to liberate blacks. And so he is good about bringing in arguments, religious arguments, using the Bible to justify the need for emancipation. So this is something that he felt, and if you look at both movements within the African American community, whites are not gonna really be behind Walker because it's a little bit too extreme. Ultimately, they had a convention and they discussed what would be the best way to achieve race equality. And they eventually came to the conclusion that they needed a little bit more of a in the middle, not too slow like the social uplift, but not too extreme or radical like David Walker. So they decided that they were going to choose something more in the middle, where they would be active in the community, getting signatures, going to Congress, passing out pamphlets, brochures, everything to get the masses educated. So this is a picture of Walker's appeal, and again, this is he's justifying the need for a revolt by slaves. So something that David Walker was promoting, violence, eventually did take place under the Turner Rebellion. Uh, this rebellion eventually set forward several changes in the South. So, just a little bit of background on Turner's rebellion. Um, he organizes a rebellion in Virginia. He eventually is impacted by the selling of his wife, separation of his wife, and eventually turned to a field worker. He had learned how to read and write, so therefore he must have been a indoor slave or house slave. And eventually, he used to get these visions, religious visions, spiritual visions, where God spoke to him. And so, um, before his rebellion, he eventually gets assigned that he's supposed to attack. He's supposed to rebel and free his people. That he's fighting the evil kingdom of this world. And eventually, he proclaims that he's just a messenger, right? That he is being basically like Christ being crucified. But the impact is not really what he did, and the rebellion was unsuccessful, but it really created a huge impact. Number one, whites retaliated with violence in black communities. They killed anywhere between 120 and 160 blacks, slaves, free blacks. That it was a form of retaliation. Second, and probably the most important impact is Virginia eventually passes stricter slave codes that force um, citizens to limit their interactions with slaves. Well, very important, the inability to teach them. So it's prohibited to teach them how to read, because if they read, they become aware and they could eventually run a rebellion. You limited the movement of slaves from state to state, so there was a lot less selling or trading of slaves between plantations. And again, this idea of teaching them something so simple of teaching someone to read was prohibited by whites. In regards to the abolitionist movement with whites, it also varied. You had people like William Lloyd Garrison, who is a white northerner who was a huge advocate for the end of slavery. He was a little bit more of a radical abolitionist. He felt like slavery needed to end under any circumstance, under any way. Like no matter what, this has to end. If it has to be violence, if people have to die, then there has to be. He eventually publishes a newspaper called The Liberator. He's really the most influential abolitionist of his time because he really pushed for the end of slavery. Then you have the Grimke sisters, who eventually are born in South Carolina but moved to Pennsylvania to become Quakers. If you remember Quakerism, they're anti-slavery. And in collaboration with Theodore Wald, they publish American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of a Dozen Witnesses. So what they do is they interview fugitives who had left the South and eventually uh, collect all this evidence and literally display it to the masses in the North. Theodore Wald also wrote a literary piece that made huge impact. His literary work was The Bible Against Slavery. So basically used passages from the Bible to attack those who used slavery. And so that you would say that that is those who were for abolitionism, but then you have those whites who are anti-abolitionist. Um, really, in the North, minority of them actually followed. I'd say 10% of the northern population was for abolitionism. Huge um, thought and movement there was that a lot of the white population were opposed, universally opposed to amalgamation, which is basically the racial mixing. And so, if you're talking about, what abolitionist is, it's free slaves, but then slaves are supposed to become equals in society. So they eventually were a big part of the population was very anti mixing of races or intermarriage. So in the north, you had a population of whites who eventually attacked churches, temperance halls, homes, conventions, anything that dealt with abolitionists, they were after. And you eventually see that there's a part in the North that is anti-abolitionist, not just in the South. So Congress eventually passes what's known as the gag rule. in the House of Reps, they eventually put a gag rule to stop all proposals that were for anti-slavery. So they didn't want to have that conversation then. So any petitioning, any proposals about anti-slavery were eventually shelved, and it eventually stays in place from 1836 to 1844. So the violence that eventually spread in the North didn't really deter the movement, didn't deter the motivation that these abolitionists had. They knew deep down inside that slavery was bad and inhumane and needed to end. It was like they feel like shameful that they lived in a country and were citizens of a country that still held slaves. So the abolitionists are really going to push this movement by informing the masses, whether it's this great postal campaign where literally tons and tons of pamphlets are being distributed to in the north, in the south, where people are basically informing just the spread of information, right? There is going to be an institution within the abolitionist movement that is used to free slaves. The Underground Railroad is a system of roads. It's not an actual railroad. It's just a series of routes, safe houses, depots throughout the United States and even into Canada that allow for escaped slaves to reach freedom. One of the most important conductors of this Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman, who is said to have saved or brought to liberty over 300 slaves. And again, so this is the movement. A lot of abolitionists are pushing for the end of slavery, and then while that gets done through laws, then there is also that side where they're helping escape. And a lot of abolitionists, whites, helped in the preparation of the Underground Railroad. Imagine, spanning from the south to north and even into Canada, you have to have safe houses throughout this location. Sometimes underneath churches, basements, hidden doors, just a way to be able to hide slaves and be able to get them into freedom, right? So the idea is that as a society, right, uh, it was time to end slavery. The abolitionist movement really pushed for the end of slavery and had many tactics, like you saw Lloyd Garrison, Theodore Wald, the Gramsci sisters. They used literary works to get information. Other tactics were to eventually pass more information through pamphlets, spread it throughout the United States, and then establishing something like the Underground Railroad that is going to assist the masses and be able to get them to freedom. One of the things that we look at, right, is that we're literally getting closer and closer to our Civil War. The Nat Rebellion was really something that pushed it forward. It really made the United States to focus on slavery. Well, a lot of times they'd like to push it off to the side. It was front and center, and it would continue to be front and center. So overall, the abolitionist movement eventually had somewhat success. It was growing as more information was spread, more people became aware. A lot more petitions were written to get legislation passed, and especially in the District of Columbia, and just basically ending, limiting any way that they could deter slavery. That was what they were going to do.